May 1945. The war was over, but for the women huddled in the back of the transport truck, peace didn't feel like freedom. It felt like falling into the unknown. The rain had been constant since morning, fine, silver, and endless. Each drop thudded softly against the canvas roof as the truck lurched along a dirt road bordered by tall English trees. Inside, 23 German women sat shoulder to shoulder, silent except for the creak of boots and the rattle of chains against metal. Greta Henke, once a nurse in Hamburg, sat with her hands clasped in her lap, nails digging into her palms hard enough to draw blood. Across from her, 19-year-old Doro Brandt whispered a prayer under her breath, the kind she'd forgotten during the air raids. No one spoke above a whisper. No one dared to ask what would happen next. When the truck finally stopped, the driver called out, "All right, ladies, out you come." The voice was young, calm, almost casual. Greta's breath caught. English, real English. The sound she'd only ever heard through propaganda reels and intercepted broadcasts, now clear, close, human. They climbed down one by one, boots sinking into wet grass. The rain had stopped, but the world still glistened, the sky a pale gray bowl, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else. Cleanliness. Before them stood rows of wooden barracks, painted neat and green, lined with flower boxes. A British flag hung from a pole near the gate. Beyond the barbed wire fence, Greta could see soldiers, not with whips or rifles at the ready, but walking slowly, talking, laughing. The first thing that struck her was their posture. Straight but not rigid, disciplined but not cruel. They moved like men who carried no burden heavier than their own bodies. "Move along," said the guard at the gate, though his tone carried no threat. He was tall, clean-shaven, freckles across his nose, maybe 20 at most. When Doro stumbled on the step, he reached out instinctively, steadying her by the elbow. "Careful," he said. "Bit slick today." Doro blinked, eyes wide. She'd braced for a shove. Instead, she got a smile. Inside the camp, a woman in a khaki uniform waited near the entrance, a British sergeant with a clipboard. Her name tag read S. Collins. "You'll find this place orderly," Collins said, her accent crisp. "Meals at 6, work details posted tomorrow. Anyone needing medical care reports to the infirmary." Her gaze swept the group, not with hostility but appraisal. "You follow the rules and you'll have no trouble here." Greta expected suspicion. Instead, she heard efficiency, the same tone she'd once used giving orders to her nurses. That first night, the women lay awake in narrow bunks, staring at the ceiling boards. Somewhere beyond the fence, a radio played softly, a man's voice singing in English. The melody floated through the rain, light and haunting. Greta turned toward Marlene, the woman in the bunk beside hers. "Do you understand the words?" she whispered. Marlene shook her head. "No, but it doesn't sound like victory music." The next morning brought sunlight, weak, watery, but real. The guard served porridge, tea, and a slice of bread with butter. Real butter. Greta stared at it for a full minute before taking a bite. The taste made her throat tighten. "They feed prisoners this?" Doro murmured. "Not even our soldiers had this much. Maybe it's to make us soft," Marlene muttered. "To make us forget." But Greta wasn't sure. She'd spent months in hospital stitching up boys who screamed for mothers already dead, scraping mold from bread, watching hope starve in the eyes of everyone she treated. And now here, in enemy hands, she was eating butter and listening to laughter drift through the air like the war had never happened. Later, during roll call, she saw them again. The British soldiers. One of them caught her eye, the freckled guard from yesterday. He wasn't looking with disdain or pity, just curiosity. For a brief second, their gazes met and Greta looked away quickly, her face burning. That night, she wrote in her small notebook, the only thing they'd let her keep. They smiled too easily. Maybe they're mocking us, or maybe they're just not broken like we are. Marlene read over her shoulder and whispered, "We've never seen men like this, have we?" Greta shook her head. "No," she said softly. "Never." The phrase lingered between them. "We've never seen men like this. Heavy, confused, dangerous in its honesty." For the first time, the word enemy didn't feel right anymore. That night, as the rain returned, Greta couldn't sleep. She lay listening to the faint laughter from the British barracks, the kind of laughter that came from warmth, not cruelty. It was the sound of something she hadn't heard since before the bombs, something she didn't know still existed. It was the sound of peace. The days began to fall into a rhythm, the kind of rhythm that made time feel heavier, not lighter. Dawn sirens, the scraping of boots on gravel, the clink of tin mugs, the muted voices of women trying not to think too loudly. Greta learned that British mornings smelled different. Instead of smoke and iron, there was tea, strong, earthy, poured from kettles that never seemed to run dry. The guards drank it constantly, leaning on fences, blowing steam off the surface before sipping. It wasn't the drink that fascinated her, but the ease with which they did it, no fear, no hurry, no hunger behind their eyes. She'd never realized peace had a smell. After breakfast, they were assigned to work detail, laundry, kitchen, or infirmary. Greta was placed in the infirmary, where the scent of antiseptic mixed with soap and lemon polish. The British medic in charge, Corporal Davies, was young, with sandy hair and a voice too kind for a uniform. He gave instructions slowly, as if translating mercy. "Fold the bandages in thirds," he told her one morning. "Not too tight. We reuse them until we can't." Greta nodded, careful, deliberate. She expected suspicion, that constant watchfulness she'd come to know in every command. But Davies didn't hover. He trusted her hands. When she accidentally dropped a roll of gauze into a bucket of disinfectant, she braced for a reprimand. Instead, he chuckled, fished it out, and said, "Well, at least it's clean now." The sound of his laughter startled her more than any shout could have. It was warm, effortless. By midday, she had begun memorizing the details of their world. The way the soldiers stood when they smoked, shoulders loose. The way they spoke to each other, mate, old chap, love, words that carried no venom. Even the way they handled the prisoners was strange. Firm, yes, but not cruel. When one woman fainted from the heat, a guard removed his cap, knelt and carried her to the shade. Greta had to look away. The gesture felt too intimate, too human to witness. Later, while folding sheets, Doro leaned close and whispered, "They laugh while they work. Have you noticed?" Greta nodded slowly.
"Yes. It's like the war never touched them." Greta thought for a moment before replying.
Maybe it did. Maybe they just learned how to live anyway. That night, after curfew, the barracks were filled with whispers. The women lay on their bunks, voices low, as if they were telling ghost stories. "They don't shout," one woman murmured. "They don't look at us with disgust," said another. "They don't even look hungry," Doro added, almost envious. Marlene's voice broke through the dark. "They're the victors. They can afford to be kind." Greta turned on her side. "Kindness isn't a luxury," she said softly. "It's a habit." The conversation ended there, but the words lingered like smoke. 2 days later, during roll call, a group of British soldiers passed by the women's line. They were laughing about something, a football match perhaps. One of them, tall with striking blue eyes, caught Greta's gaze. He smiled briefly, polite, unbothered, before walking on. That smile haunted her for the rest of the day. Not because it was flirtatious. It wasn't, it was normal, a simple acknowledgement that she existed. For 3 years, no man had looked at her like that. Not as a soldier, not as property, not as an enemy. Just as a person. That night, she found herself awake long after lights out, staring at the cracks in the wooden ceiling. Outside, the guards were singing again, a rough, off-key chorus carried by the wind. She didn't recognize the tune, but it made her eyes sting anyway. Doro whispered from the bunk below. "Do you think they ever hated us?" Greta hesitated. "I think they were too busy winning." "Then why are they nice?" "I don't know," Greta whispered back. "Maybe because they can be." The next morning, the rain returned, soft and persistent. Greta was sent to deliver folded linens to the officers' quarters. As she passed the open door of the mess hall, she caught a glimpse inside. Tables neatly arranged, white plates, spoons gleaming under hanging lamps. The same freckled soldier she'd seen before was there, cleaning his rifle, humming again. He looked up briefly and nodded at her. Not with authority, with acknowledgement. For reasons she couldn't explain, her heart tightened. Back in the barracks, she wrote in her notebook, "They treat us like people, and it hurts worse than hate, because it reminds me what we were told they weren't." That evening, Marlene read it aloud and shook her head. "Don't start feeling sorry for them, Greta." "I'm not," Greta replied. "I'm starting to feel sorry for us." The wind rattled the barrack windows. and for a long time neither woman spoke. By the end of the week, the camp no longer felt like a cage, not because it was free, but because it was human. The food, the work, the order, even the laughter from the other side of the fence, all of it chipped away at the lies they'd been raised on. For the first time, Greta realized that defeat didn't always come with punishment. Sometimes it came with grace. Morning sunlight spilled across the camp like something unearned. For the first time in months, it wasn't gray. The mud had begun to dry, leaving pale tracks of footprints between the barracks. Greta sat on the step outside, her tin mug warm between her palms, watching the guards change shifts. There was something disarming about their routine. The way the men joked as they handed over rifles, how one flicked the other's cap in jest before walking off to breakfast. They didn't look like conquerors. They looked like brothers teasing each other before work. A guard named Collins, not the sergeant but a private with a sharp grin, passed by carrying a stack of papers. He nodded politely. "Morning, miss." The word hit her like a small stone. Miss, not prisoner, not number. Just miss. Greta managed a stiff nod. "Morning." The syllables felt foreign in her mouth, like speaking peace in a language she didn't deserve. Later that day, the women were escorted to the fields. Rows of green stretched beyond the camp, barley and cabbage, their colors soft and unreal after years of gray cities. They were told to help with sorting vegetables, a harmless task meant to keep their hands busy. The work was quiet. No overseers shouting, no boots kicking at ankles, just the sound of hands brushing soil and the occasional call of birds overhead. Halfway through the morning, a young British soldier dropped his cap into the dirt. Doro, who had been working closest to him, bent down instinctively and picked it up. Their eyes met. The soldier looked startled for a heartbeat, then smiled. A real smile, wide and human. "Thank you," he said softly. Doro hesitated, her fingers brushing the fabric. "You're welcome," she whispered, her accent thick. When she returned to the others, her cheeks were flushed. "He thanked me," she said, half laughing, half trembling. "Like properly," Marlene frowned. "Don't get carried away." "It's pity," Greta shook her head. "No, it's habit." "What do you mean?" "They don't have to hate us," Greta said. "It's just not in them." The words lingered long after the day's work ended. In the evenings, the guards sometimes played football in the open yard. The women would watch from behind the wire, pretending not to watch, pretending not to care. But their eyes betrayed them. There was an ease to the soldiers' movements that felt almost alien. They shouted, laughed, tumbled into the dirt, got up grinning. One man, shirt untucked and hair damp with sweat, ran past the fence and waved toward the women's side. For a moment, the fence between them didn't seem like punishment. It seemed like the last fragile line between two worlds, one dying, one already reborn. That night, Greta couldn't sleep. The laughter from the game still echoed in her ears. She remembered the way the man's smile had looked, open, careless, untouched by guilt. She tried to picture a German soldier laughing like that after the war. She couldn't. The next morning brought drizzle and fog, soft enough to blur the edges of everything. Greta was back in the infirmary, folding gauze, when Corporal Davies entered carrying a crate of supplies. He set it down and rubbed his neck. "Busy morning," he muttered. Then, catching her glance, he added with a small grin, "You lot doing all right today?" Greta hesitated before answering. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir," he said. "Makes me feel old." "How old are you?" 22, Greta blinked. "You're younger than I am." "Then I guess you can call me lad," he said, chuckling. The sound startled her again. Not the laugh, but the warmth it carried. For a moment, the infirmary didn't smell like antiseptic. It smelled like home. As the days passed, something unspoken began to shift among the women. Their posture softened. The stiffness in their voices eased. They began saying thank you when handed their rations, please when asking for water. Small words that had been beaten out of them by years of hierarchy and fear now found their way back into their mouths. And the guards noticed, not with pride, not with gloating, just quiet acknowledgement, like watching a wound begin to close. One evening, as the women lined up for roll call, Greta caught sight of the same freckled soldier again, the one from her first day. He was standing at ease, cap tilted, watching the sun sink behind the trees. For a moment, their eyes met again. He nodded once, then looked away. That night, she wrote another line in her notebook. They smile too easily. But maybe that's what victory looks like when it's honest. Marlene saw it and scoffed. You're letting them get into your head. Greta didn't look up. Maybe they're getting into the part that still remembers what being human feels like. Silence fell. Even Marlene couldn't argue with that. Outside, a radio played faintly from the guards' quarters. A British voice, smooth, deep, spoke about rebuilding Europe, about unity, about hope. The words were too far away to catch, but the tone carried warmth. Dora whispered, "Do you think they'll let us stay here after the war?" Greta didn't answer. She stared out the window at the soldiers laughing near the goalpost, their silhouettes soft in the fading light. Maybe, she thought, this was what freedom looked like. Not victory, not flags, just the ability to laugh without fear, and for the first time in years she smiled too. By the third month in camp, the barbed wire had stopped feeling like a cage. It felt like a mirror, reflecting everything they had believed about strength and everything that now seemed false. Greta couldn't stop noticing the small things. How the British soldiers polished their boots even on rainy days. How they passed cigarettes around before lighting their own. How they said please even when giving orders. It wasn't power that held this camp together. It was decency, and that was harder to bear than cruelty. One morning, a storm hit. Heavy rain, howling wind, thunder that shook the barracks. The yard turned into a sea of mud. Greta and the others were ordered to help reinforce the supply tent. It was freezing, her hands numb as she tied down ropes that whipped against the poles. Suddenly, the wind caught one of the canvas sheets, snapping it loose. It came crashing down, hitting Doro across the face. She fell hard, her knee twisting beneath her. Greta ran to her side, calling for help. Within seconds, 2 soldiers were there. One of them the tall, blue-eyed guard. He crouched beside Doro, steady, calm like he'd done this before. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe." He examined the knee, then signaled another soldier. Together, they lifted Doro with surprising gentleness and carried her toward the infirmary. Greta followed, heart pounding. Inside, Corporal Davies, the medic, worked quickly. Disinfectant, splint, bandage. Doro cried silently, not from pain but humiliation. Greta stood frozen, watching British hands care for German wounds. "Nothing broken," Davies said after a moment. "Just a bad sprain." "She'll be fine." Greta's voice trembled. "You don't have to." He looked up. "Of course we do." The words were so simple, so clean that she didn't know how to answer. That night, Doro slept through the pain, her leg elevated on folded blankets. Greta sat beside her bunk long after lights out, listening to the rain and the faraway laughter of the guards. Marlene stirred in her bed. "You're still awake?" Greta nodded. "You're thinking about them again, aren't you?" Greta hesitated. "About everything." Marlene sat up, her face barely visible in the dark. "Don't let their kindness fool you. They're still the enemy." "Are they?" Greta asked quietly. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. A week later, the storm passed. The sky cleared into a soft blue that looked impossibly clean, as if the world itself had been washed. Greta and Marlene were assigned to laundry duty again, hanging sheets in the wind. Beyond the fence, soldiers were playing football. Their laughter rolled across the yard like music. One of them shouted something about a goal and the rest cheered. The sound made Greta's stomach twist with something she couldn't name. Marlene muttered, "They laugh too much." Greta smiled faintly. "Maybe we didn't laugh enough." At lunch, Sergeant Collins made an announcement. A group of POWs would be transferred north for repatriation. The news spread through the camp like a chill. Some women rejoiced, eager to go home. Others fell silent. Home wasn't a place anymore, just rubble and memory. That evening, Greta found herself near the fence again. The blue-eyed soldier was there, mending one of the posts. He looked up, nodded once, then gestured to the sky. "Clear tonight," he said. Greta followed his gaze. The clouds had broken, revealing stars, bright and endless. For years, the sky had been black with smoke. Now it was alive again. "They used to tell us," she said softly, her German accent thick, "that you were monsters." He raised an eyebrow. "And now?" She hesitated. "Now I think maybe we were the ones who forgot how to be human." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. When Greta returned to the barracks, she found Marlene staring at a torn photograph. A young man in uniform, smiling awkwardly. Her fiancé, dead since 1943. They said he died for honor, Marlene whispered. But now I wonder if he just died for nothing. Greta sat beside her. He died believing what he was told. So did all of us. Marlene laughed bitterly. And what do we believe now? Greta looked toward the window. The sound of British laughter drifted in again. Not mockery, just life. I think, she said, we start by believing this. The world didn't end with us. Marlene said nothing. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. The next morning, the British soldiers brought fresh bread to the mess hall. It was still warm, wrapped in cloth. Greta tore a piece, tasted it, soft, rich, alive with yeast and salt. She closed her eyes. It wasn't just food. It was proof that kindness could exist after catastrophe. Later, while scrubbing floors, she overheard two guards talking. Hard lot, these women, one said. But they work hard. Can't blame them, the other replied. War's over. Someone's got to start mending things. Mending things. The phrase stayed in her head long after they walked away. That night, as the lamps dimmed, Greta opened her notebook and wrote one line across the last clean page. The British never conquered us. They reminded us what we'd lost. She stared at the words until her vision blurred, because somewhere deep inside she knew it was true. Winter came quietly to the camp. The kind that crept in without snow, just colder air, longer shadows, and breath turning to smoke in the morning line. By now, the war had ended. They heard it not from an officer, but from a radio left playing near the barracks door. The voice on the broadcast was British, calm and formal. Germany has surrendered. Hostilities will cease at midnight, no shouts, no tears, just silence. The words fell like stones into still water. Greta didn't cheer. None of them did. The end of war didn't sound like victory. It sounded like exhaustion. That evening, the camp mess hall was warmer than usual. The British soldiers had lit a fire, the first they'd allowed in months. The air smelled of wood smoke and stew. The women sat quietly on one side of the hall, the soldiers on the other. No barriers, no guards with rifles this time, just the hum of crackling logs and spoons clinking against bowls. Corporal Thomas Wren, his arm now fully healed, walked to their table and set down a tray. On it sat something round and golden, the smell impossibly sweet. Apple pie, he said, smiling. Figured you might as well know what we fight for. The women stared at it as if it were a relic. Doro leaned forward first. Like the cheesecake? Thomas laughed. Sort of. But better. He sliced it carefully, steam rising from the crust. Greta hesitated, then took a bite. It was warm, rich, spiced with cinnamon, something that tasted like home even though it wasn't hers. When she swallowed, tears burned behind her eyes. It's too much, Thomas nodded. That's what peace is supposed to be. Marlene stared at him for a long moment. You forgive us? She asked. Her voice trembled, but it wasn't fear, it was disbelief. Thomas didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, then said, Forgiveness isn't mine to give. But I can choose not to hate you. The words hit harder than any bullet could. That night, Greta dreamed of home, not the ruined streets of Berlin, but the version that existed before. Her mother hanging laundry, her father whistling through his mustache, sunlight slanting through curtains. When she woke, her pillow was wet. The next morning, an officer arrived with papers. Transport leaves at dawn, he announced. You'll be processed for repatriation to Germany. No one spoke. Marlene's hands shook as she folded her blanket. We're going back to nothing, she whispered. Greta nodded slowly. Maybe that's the point. We build something else. Hours later, as the truck rumbled toward the docks, the women sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces pressed to the slats. The countryside blurred past. Green hills, quiet farms, people walking unarmed and unafraid. When they reached the pier, British soldiers helped them down, one by one. Greta's boots hit the planks with a hollow sound. In her pocket, she carried a small folded note, a recipe written in English in Thomas Wren's careful handwriting. Apple pie, British style. She'd asked for it half-jokingly. He'd given it to her without hesitation. Every recipe's a kind of history, he'd said. This one just happens to be sweet. Greta stood at the edge of the dock, watching the ship's shadow stretch across the water. Doro was crying quietly beside her. Marlene, for once, wasn't pretending to be strong. They'll never believe us, Marlene said. They don't have to, Greta replied. We just have to remember. The British officer on deck called out names. When Greta stepped forward, Thomas was there, helping passengers board. He met her eyes one last time and then nodded. No salute, no words, just that same quiet acknowledgement that had started it all. As she crossed the gangway, Greta whispered, "Thank you." Thomas's answer was simple. "Don't thank me. Just live better than we did." The ship horn sounded low and mournful. The women lined the rail, watching England fade into mist. The sea wind stung their faces, but none of them looked away. When night fell, Greta unfolded the recipe again under the lantern's light. The ink had smudged, but the words were still there. Butter, flour, apples, sugar, patience, patience. Doro leaned over her shoulder. "You'll make it when we get home?" Greta smiled faintly. "No, I'll make it when home feels real again." She looked out at the black waves. Endless. Forgiving, alive, and for the first time since capture, she didn't feel like a prisoner. War had taken her country, her pride, her certainty. But kindness, absurd ordinary kindness, had given her something back, the unbearable. Beautiful burden of seeing her enemies as human. She closed her eyes and whispered the truth she'd been afraid to say aloud. We were wrong about everything, and they showed us by doing nothing more than being kind. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, gilding the horizon in light. Greta stood at the rail, hair whipping in the wind, holding the folded recipe like a promise. Behind her, Doro murmured, "You think they'll forget us?" Greta shook her head. "No, but I think they'll forgive us faster than we forgive ourselves." And somewhere, far behind on the British coast, a soldier with blue-gray eyes lit a cigarette, glanced toward the sea and smiled, not in victory, but in quiet relief that maybe, just maybe, decency had survived the war.